Hello, welcome back. This is the vocabulary lesson for the conversation Moving as a Child, Part 1. This is a two-part conversation. Now, in this first conversation, I'm talking with Joe about my nephew moving. Then Joe and I start talking about how we each moved when we were younger. Okay, let's begin with the conversation. I start out by saying, hey. And hey is I'm just trying to get Joe's attention here. So I say, hey, I was on the phone with my mom earlier today. I had a nice long conversation with her. And Joe says, oh, how's she doing? Now, oh here, this is just filler. It's not really needed. You could take it away from the sentence and the sentence would still make sense. How's she doing? How's is short for how is. And doing is short for doing. Now, as I say in every lesson, you will hear words that are shortened, and you won't really see these shortened words in written English. You'll definitely hear them, though, in conversational English. Okay, moving along, and then I say, yeah. Yeah is just slang or informal or casual for yes. And I go on to say, she's doing good. And then I say, she said to tell you hello, by the way. Now, by the way, this means in addition to, but it's less important. It's not as important as what I had been talking about. By the way. An example of this would be if, let's say, Joe and I were talking about a trip that we're going to be taking to Africa at the end of the year. So we're talking about this trip to Africa, and then I say, oh, by the way, I'm going to eat dinner with AJ tonight. That's an example of by the way. Okay, and then getting back to the conversation, Joe says, oh, nice. And then I say, yeah, I thought this kind of came out of the blue. Now, kind of is just filler here. It's not really needed. Out of the blue. Out of the blue means sudden and unexpected. Out of the blue. For example, out of the blue, my mother told me today that my cousin just had a baby. I didn't even know that she was pregnant. Out of the blue. And I go on to say, I'd never heard it before, but she was telling me how my nephew moved. Tellin'. This is short for telling. And then Joe says, oh, he just moved? Now, this is really filler here. You could take it away and the sentence would still make sense. And I say, yeah, is just filler. And I go on to say, they had been living in the city limits. Or I'm saying they had been living inside the city. And then I say, and now they're living in the county. Now, a county, this is a large area that has a city or cities within it. For example, you have a city or cities, and then you have a county that has the city or cities within it. And then a state has counties in it, within it. And I go on to say, so that means he's no longer gonna be going to the city schools. Now, gonna, this is just slang for going to. And I go on to say, he'll be going to a county school. He's changed school districts, or he's changed schools. So basically what I'm saying here is my nephew has been living in a city called Gainesville. It's in the state of Georgia. And he and his family have moved out of the city, moved into the county. So he's changing schools. He won't be going to a Gainesville city school anymore. He'll be going to a school that's in the county, in the area that's outside of the city. And then Joe says, "Oh, wow." Now here he's just showing emotions such as, "Wow, I feel sorry for him." And Joe goes on to say, "That can actually be pretty traumatic." Now actually is just filler here. It's not really needed. And pretty here is very, very traumatic. Traumatic, this means something that's difficult and upsetting. Traumatic. For example, when Kim was a child, she was in the car when her mother crashed the car. It was a traumatic experience. Traumatic. Okay, so getting back to the conversation, Joe's saying, it can actually be pretty traumatic to do something like that as a kid, to do something such as that as a kid or child. And Joe says, so Joe's starting to say what I'm trying to say. And then I say, yeah, and they've just started back to school. So I'm saying they've just started the new school year. And then I say, so I'm wondering, or I'm saying I've been thinking about him, and I go on to say how he's doing at a completely new school. New kids, everything being new. And Joe says, well is just filler here. It's not really needed. And Joe says, at least, or he's saying it's good, he didn't have to move like in the middle of the school year. That can be really difficult, or that can be very difficult from an educational standpoint. Now, educational standpoint, this is describing education. For example, when I was a child and my family moved, we moved to an area that had much better schools. So I would say that moving was good from an educational standpoint. Educational standpoint. And Joe goes on to say, and you know is short for you know. And Joe says, it's really tough, or he's saying it's very difficult to get settled in. Settled in. This means adjusted or used to. Settled in. For example, I can remember the flight to Thailand being 20 hours long. It was so long. Because it was so long, it took me a day to get settled in. Settled in. And then Joe goes on to say, especially, or he's saying most importantly, when you do it mid-year. Now, mid-year, this means in the middle of the year. And then I say, that's true. And although, or I'm saying even though, he's still in the same area, he's close enough to still be participating in, or he's close enough to still be playing in the same Little League sports. Now, is just filler. It's not really needed. Little League sports. This is a group of sports teams for children. Little League sports. An example of Little League sports would be Joe played Little League sports when he was a child. He loved to play baseball. Little League sports. And then I go on to say, and like is just filler here. I think he's still going to be on the same baseball team. So he'll still see those same kids, or he'll still be around those same kids. And Joe says, oh, that's good. That'll make the transition easier. Transition. This is change. Transition. For example, when Joe moved at the age of 12, it was a difficult transition. He missed his friends in New York. Transition. And then I say, right. So I'm just saying yes. I'm agreeing with Joe. And then Joe says, wow, man. Now, he's just showing emotion here. And Joe goes on to say, you know what? That just made me remember the time when I moved as a kid. You know, I was pretty fortunate. Fortunate. This means lucky. Fortunate. An example of fortunate is Harry is very fortunate. One day he was walking home from work and he found $100. Fortunate. And then Joe goes on to say, I only moved one time. And you know, some kids have to move a lot. Like army brats, for example. Army brats. These are children of parents who are in the military, who usually move a lot. Now, the military is the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines. That's what military is or means. An example of army brats would be, when I was younger, I knew a girl named Katie. She was an army brat. Her family moved 5 times in 6 years. Army brat, or in this example, army brats. And continuing with the conversation, I then say, yeah. I'm just agreeing with Joe. And then Joe says, I mean, I've had some friends whose parents were in the army and they moved a lot. But, you know, I guess it's easier when you're younger, but there comes a point where... Now, comes a point. This means comes a time. There comes a time. For example, there comes a point when most Americans leave their parents' home or homes to go to college, to start working, or to start a family. Comes a point. And Joe goes on to say, you know, it gets really difficult. Like when you're a teenager. Now, teenager, this is a person between 13 and 19 years old. Teenager. An example of teenager would be, in America, teenagers are not allowed to drink alcohol. You have to be 21 years old. Teenager. And then I say, oh yeah, I've... And Joe says, when I moved, I was just about a teenager, so I know. So Joe's saying, I was just about a teenager. I was almost a teenager. And then I say, well, I've only moved once too. Or I'm saying, I've only moved once also. And I go on to say, when I was a child, and I was 8. So I'm saying I was 8 years old. And I go on to say, and that was pretty tough for me. And Joe says, yeah, well, you can't imagine, or he's saying you can't even think how difficult it must have been for me. I mean, I moved from New York, where I had lived my entire life, or he's saying I'd lived my whole life. And then he says, my whole family was there. Now, what he's talking about is his grandparents, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins. So that would be his extended family. His immediate family would be his mother, his father, his brothers, his sisters. So he's saying his whole family was there, his whole extended family, his grandparents, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins. And then Joe goes on to say, I had never moved before, so all my friends lived there. And then I moved to Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania, this is a northeastern state in America. Pennsylvania. And Joe goes on to say, rural Pennsylvania. Rural, this is an area where there is farmland. Rural. An example of rural would be, Joe moved from New York to a rural part of the country. He had never lived near a farm before that time. Rural. It's the opposite of city. And then Joe goes on to say, it was a complete, or he's starting to say here, it was a total. And I say, oh gosh, I'm just showing emotion, like, I don't believe it. And then Joe finishes by saying culture shock. It was a complete or total culture shock. Culture shock. This is a feeling, or this is when you feel uncomfortable when you move to another place and the people are different than the place you lived before. So feeling uncomfortable when you move to another place and the people are different than the place you lived before. That's culture shock. For example, I can remember when I moved to Korea, it was a culture shock. I'd never been to an Asian country before. It was very different from America. Culture shock. And then I say, yeah, I bet. I bet means I agree. I bet. And then Joe says, and here is just filler. It's not really needed. Joe goes on to say, what's worse is, not only did it seem different to me, I seemed totally, or he's saying I seemed completely or very different to all the kids there. And then I just laugh. And Joe says, because, first off, or he's saying first, and he goes on to say, I had this really thick, or he's saying, I had this very strong New York accent. Now, accent, this is the way it sounds when someone speaks. Accent. For example, the people in the southern part of America have a strong accent. Accent. And then I just laugh. And Joe says, so right off the bat, or he's saying right away, immediately, right off the bat. For example, an example of right off the bat. I found a job right off the bat when I moved to San Francisco. Right off the bat. And Joe goes on to say, they knew right away that I was not from there. And then I laugh again and I say, right, just agreeing with him. And Joe says, it was obvious, or he's saying everyone knew, I was the new kid on the block. New kid on the block. This means new to an area, or new person to an area. New kid on the block. For example, when I first moved to San Francisco, I really felt like the new kid on the block. I did not even know where a grocery store was located. New kid on the block. And then I say, just agreeing with Joe. And then Joe says, and I looked different also because the style in New York was much different, or he's saying was very different than it was in Pennsylvania. Now, style. Style is fashion. Style. For example, I really liked the way the women in India were dressed when I was there. They have a much different style than the women in America. Style. Okay, this is the end of the vocabulary lesson for the conversation Moving as a Child, Part 1. If you feel that you need to, go back and listen as many times as you need to make sure that you understand or have a basic understanding of the vocabulary. And then when you're ready, move on to Joe's mini story. All right. See you for Moving as a Child Part 2. Bye-bye. Hi, this is Kristen Dodds.
And this is Joe Weiss. And we just wanted to let you know that this material has been copyrighted in the year 2008 by Learn Real English, LLC. www.learnrealenglish.com